Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of Kingston Conversations, a series of online talks hosted by Kingston Gallery, Boston. Our artist-run gallery model allows us the flexibility to launch online events such as this during this challenging time for all, reaching a broader audience, community, personal, timely, and impactful discourse in arts practices. Kingston Gallery is an artist-run gallery incorporated in 1982 and is Boston's second oldest such institution presently in operation. The gallery exhibits the work of Boston area contemporary artists and features a diverse range of media, including painting, photography, sculpture, and installation. Located in the SoA district in the South End, the exhibitions are free and open to the public. During this time, exhibitions are open only by appointment and emailing info@kingstongallery.com. For more information, please visit kingstongallery.com, sign up for a newsletter, and follow us on social media. Today's discussion will be recorded and will be posted on our Facebook site and on our Kingston site. We'll take questions at the end of the panelist conversation, and please jot your questions in the chat channel. We'll try to get to as many as we can. We'd like to thank Ing Ruchen, Marketing Director for Kingston Gallery, for coordinating today's event. It's my pleasure to introduce the panelists joining the conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Susan Emmerson, Kingston Gallery artist and medical surgeon during the height of the AIDS epidemic, who recently exhibited work at Kingston that reflected upon natural disasters fueled by climate change. And joining us as special guest panelist, Antoinette LaFarge, artist, writer, visual researcher, and professor of art at UC Irvine, whose practice includes the multi-year project, the AIDS Chronicles, as well as the AIDS Bottle Project. And I'm Amy Kaczur, moderating today's talk and associate artist member of Kingston Gallery. Welcome, everyone. Let's start with a question for Susan. When the idea of Kingston Conversations Online was introduced, you offered to participate and propose a conversation bridging AIDS and COVID-19 pandemics and the artist's experience and response into focus. Could you tell us your initial thoughts for bridging the two public health crises at this time? Would you describe the definition of an epidemic and a pandemic, the timeline, and tell us what your everyday life was like then and what you saw?
Okay. I first started thinking about it because I was trying to come to grips in my own mind with how are artists going to respond to COVID? How are we going to portray the fear and the grief and the isolation and all of the other emotions we were feeling? And so I started reflecting on the AIDS epidemic, and I thought it would be helpful to look at how the art world responded to that, because I knew there was a vigorous response at the time. And so I thought I could at least contribute where I was at that time, because as a medical person, I was seeing the medical side of it. I graduated from medical school in 1982, and that was only a year after the first AIDS cases had been reported, and it was just in the process of being defined as an actual disease. They didn't even discover that it was caused by a virus until 1984. And already it was becoming quite a political controversy, and there was a lot of stigma attached to it. And so there were a lot of emotions all tied up in the public's reaction to this new disease. And so then in 1982, I started, having finished medical school, I started training to be a surgeon, and that takes 5 years. So I was there from 82 until 87. And so I was seeing how the medical world was responding, and they were trying to figure it out just like everybody else was, and just what their response was going to be. And so in 1987, they first came out with a drug that they thought would be helpful, AZT, but it wasn't by any means getting the epidemic under control. I tried to correlate this a little bit, looking at the timeline with the arts-related projects that were going on at the same time. In '87 is when they first started the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which is probably one of the best known art projects connected with this. In 1989, by that point, there were 100,000 cases in the United States. And by 1995, there were 500,000. So it was obvious that we weren't, even though we had some drugs, the epidemic was not being controlled. And it wasn't until much later when they were able to use multiple drugs on the same patient that they even started seeing a decrease in AIDS deaths. And so, you know, we've made a huge amount of progress medically since then. Now we have the prophylactic drugs where patients who are HIV negative but at high risk can take a pill twice a week, and it has greatly reduced their risk of getting AIDS. That's about medically where we are right now. And then the other question about what was happening with me. In 1987, I had just finished my residency and I was going out into practice, and I went out, I set up my practice in a smaller city, I guess you would call it, in central Illinois, which is a fairly conservative part of the country. And so I went from a big medical center where, you know, everything was based on fact, on science, and then to go in this environment where there was a lot of moralizing about it. And especially at first, you know, there were some doctors who wouldn't treat AIDS patients. And so I had, I felt like I had to make myself known as someone who was, you know, there for AIDS patients and would see them without question. And so it really brought home to me the stigma that society had put on these people and how difficult that made it. And I'm glad to see that it's gotten to the point where it's thought of as a chronic disease and not a death sentence. Did you want me to go farther with anything else about my medical experience?
I think maybe a little later on, or actually maybe in this next section, we can talk about how those experiences or the experience of your early medical career have impacted your current practice in the arts. So some of your influences and how that evolved.
Yeah.
Both you and Antoinette are both very research-based artists, and I also wanted to reach out to Antoinette also to talk about her process, audience and venues, and platforms for engagement and finding collaborators, because this was also a very not an easy subject area to do work.
Sorry.
Oh yeah.
I did. You asked for the definition of a pandemic.
Oh yes.
Epidemic. Okay. The definition of pandemic has more to do with the extent of the spread of the disease. An epidemic is a rapid spread of a disease within a certain population. And a pandemic is when it becomes worldwide, where there's no area that's inhabited by humans that has not seen a substantial number of people infected with the disease. So we are in the midst of a pandemic because it's on every continent and in most countries, as far as I know.
I wanted to actually just jump in here with a slightly side comment. I was looking at the Wikipedia pages on HIV AIDS because I was also rethinking the timeline and how it all unrolled, and the question of pandemics, whether it's global and or increasing. And I noticed that in the talk pages, there's a very active argument going on about whether AIDS still qualifies as a pandemic, because in certain areas it's still increasing among certain populations, isn't stable. But what I found really most striking about that is that the attention and care towards the facts that is being still paid on the AIDS HIV pages today, and people who think of Wikipedia still as a source of misinformation and a kind of junk encyclopedia, I think should wake up to the fact that it is now one of the frontline places to get really good solid information, because the people behind the scenes, particularly for the medically related pages, care desperately about accuracy.
They do. And that's where I went, you know, to confirm my idea of the definition of epidemic versus pandemic. And
Yeah.
it's most of the time very reliable.
I'm interested in hearing you talk a little, Susan, like Amy was suggesting, about how your medical career and your AIDS experience affected your art practice.
I think the way that it did, the way I can most see is it made me, as a doctor very early in my practice, confront death and loss and talking to people and understanding it for myself. You know, having to tell someone that they were HIV positive in that environment was a death sentence, and having to decide for myself, how would I want to be told I'm going to die, so I could do the best job possible with telling this person that they were HIV positive. And it inspired a lot of soul searching about death and loss, and it's something that I've carried with me ever since. This, like, helping people confront what seems like a random, horrible thing, a random loss and grief.
Yeah. I lived through the 80s too, like you did, with this disease that came out of nowhere and started threatening people. I knew the art community in general was very touched by this. And this sense that you were, the threat was direct and immediate and all around you. Then how do you respond to that, especially when it was a death sentence? I know that for a time I was paralyzed as an artist to deal with it, and it wasn't until I became part of a group of artists who founded an organization called the Institute of Cultural Inquiry that I started working on AIDS-related projects. And I don't know, is this maybe a good moment to sort of encapsulate that history a little bit? Partly I want to make clear that the projects I've been involved with, I did not in any way originate. They originated with an artist named Lisa Patt, who died suddenly last November, who was the founding director of the Institute of Cultural Inquiry, which is currently based in Los Angeles. It was based for a time in New York, which is where the AIDS work really started. And like many organizations and artists, the first move was really towards a memorial, a project that started out as a memorial and functioned as a memorial. So a project called the AIDS Bottle Project. Maybe I can share my screen at this point. That might be the thing to do. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen now?
I
Yeah.
can see it now.
Yes.
So the Institute, which associates and volunteers, this is an entirely volunteer project like so many at the time, and this originated around 1990. We started making these glass bottles engraved with the names of people connected to the art world, artists, curators, anyone connected, with little biographies, partly because these people's deaths were not being publicly acknowledged as what they were. There was this terrible public silence about what people were dying of and the fact that there was a lot of death. So the first thing was a sort of impulse to his memorial, but it shifted very quickly because the Institute is much more interested in sort of the conditions of culture and not in art making as an exhibition-based practice. And so what we started doing was taking these bottles around to places like educational institutions, schools, colleges, where we could have a conversation with people, an honest, open conversation about AIDS, what was happening, what the facts were, how it affected people, particularly younger people who didn't necessarily know as much and were very anxious about it, rightfully anxious about it. And the bottles, we brought them to be given away, to be stewarded by anyone who wanted to steward a bottle of somebody who had died. And also we encouraged people to add their own memorabilia to these bottles, either related to people they knew who had died of AIDS or related to people they knew who had died in some way that caused them unrequited mourning. So they were talking objects out in the world and pretexts for conversation, as well as having that unusual status in a capitalist society of an art that's a gift, that comes with very few strings attached and is a part of an exchange of humanity. And that was to me, that was an important part of the bottle project. I'm stewarding a couple of bottles to this day myself. The second and longer running project that we worked on was the AIDS Bottle Project, the AIDS Chronicles, which here you see an installation view of it. That ran from the mid-90s right up until the present day. It's just about finished now. In this project, the Institute and the artists involved with it collected the front page of the New York Times for an entire year, painted out everything that didn't have to do with AIDS. And then we would display the pages, as you see here, to make a visual record of how poor, spotty, infrequent, and otherwise problematic the coverage of AIDS was during the crucial decade of the 90s, which is when we started. In what was considered the newspaper of record for the entire country. So it was a way to try to bring home to people really viscerally the lack of coverage of something that was still killing people in the 1990s. And then these would be, we had some rituals around these that we would again do in public spaces, and we bound each year into a book. You can see a couple of them here that had covers that were created by artists, so that there's now a couple dozen sets of these that exist as a kind of physical, tangible reminder that it isn't just that we do the work of finding cures for diseases, we do the social work of acknowledging the disease, acknowledging its impact, acknowledging which communities it affects. Because one of the things you realize, I'm still finishing 1 year of the Chronicles myself, and one of the things you realize as you work through an entire year is which populations in a given year are being most talked about. for recent years, there's much more coverage of AIDS in places like Africa, because that's currently the epicenter of the uncontrolled disease for a number of reasons, not least having to do with the fact that AIDS drugs are still very expensive. So this is again a project about public education, and also being brought face to face with something in a way that's different from how you are brought face to face with things when you just read about them in the newspapers and then you can kind of walk away from them. The AIDS Chronicles are so visual that they really kind of stick with you if you've seen them. So those are the two things I've worked on. They're mainly communication and education projects.
Do you think you will do any projects related to COVID?
Personally, I don't know. I suspect so. I think the Institute is currently in transition because of the death of the founder, so we don't quite know what's going to happen with it as an institution. I've noticed myself that and I noticed this with AIDS too, and death, and anything that has to do with death, is that one's impulse as an artist comes out in a couple of different ways. There's paralysis, which is what I've been feeling for the last month or so myself. There's also light relief and kindness. I notice like Facebook is filled with pictures of flowers and food because people are trying to be kind to each other. I've actually been doing a series of silly drawings inspired by this crisis. I would never do drawings of this kind in an ordinary year. I eventually plan to share them with, nieces, little kids in my family, because that's what they are. They're little kid drawings, and yet somehow they're relieving a pressure valve that needed to be relieved. How I will work on it in this more research-based way, I don't yet know. But I'm keeping my artist mind open for that.
Yeah, I had been making art about natural disasters and destruction and random loss. And I think that at some point the COVID will fit into that, and I'm not sure just how. It's part of the reason I was thinking about this talk. So,
I have been collecting language around the coronavirus because I'm interested in how language reflects our state of mind. So that may lead to a project, I think.
Yeah.
This leads actually to a couple more questions, if you don't mind.
Please.
Me interjecting a handful of questions in here. If you could both speak about your motivation and challenges then and now, with these the overwhelming impact of these types of pandemics, public health crises, and so on, the kinds, especially now where there's economic devastation, and a lot of people are feeling it, and a lot of fear. The impact on everyday life and your practice, or you both already started to speak about that, but also the role of artists and writers, researchers, educators, activists in the time periods then and now. And I know that there are common threads. I'll name some: stigmas and gravity of the diseases, emotional, moral undercurrents, racism, ageism, xenophobia, expendable bodies of people, politicized, fears involved. I'm reading off my cheat sheet.
I was going to say, that's a lot for
my
one
cheat sheets. I know. I'm just throwing it out there. All right. So, and then the dissimilar, which is right now we have the magnitude of COVID and the speed of transmission, which has been stunning, absolutely stunning, and then it's highly contagious, and the uncertainties surrounding it. So with that,
yeah, I think
how about it?
during the AIDS epidemic, my frustration as a doctor was that I couldn't do more. I could treat the patients for the areas of their body that were within my specialty, I could talk to them. I could reach out to them and tell them that the medical community was there for them. Um, but in the end, I felt like, you know, what I can't fix anything. And I know I was not making very much art at the time, but I was really influenced by a book called And the Band Played On.
Mm-hmm.
It was published in 1987, which was about the time where I was going out into practice. And I know I read that and it just kind of crystallized everything for me. I remember thinking, this is so wrong, the way this is being handled. And it really brought home the discrimination, the stigma, you know, all the other societal judgment that surrounded it. And so it really inspired me to do more outreach in my own practice. Now I've lost track of the question again.
There's no one question.
Okay.
Well, the main question was the impact on everyday life and practice, and the role of artists, writers, researchers, educators, and activists then and now.
One thing I do see is the lack of stigma associated with COVID. It's like you don't get people saying, well, I'm a good person, so I can't get COVID. Whereas there was a lot of people, even though it wasn't true, who felt that they wouldn't get AIDS. They were moralizing.
Mm-hmm.
The AIDS was seen as a moral judgment.
Yeah, of several different kinds. A moral judgment on gay people and a moral judgment on drug users.
Exactly.
And a moral judgment in general on people who have too much sex. You're right, but it's once again, it's also the case that the pandemic has released people to feel like they can talk about who's expendable, right? And so the categories of who's expendable are different this time. It's old people, people with disabilities, people of color who are being disproportionately affected by this pandemic in certain ways. So whenever we start hearing people say things like we should open the market and cut our costs, we start to hear that kind of coded language. Nobody will come right out and say, I don't really mind if a bunch of other people die as long as I can get my job back. And the subtext is always, somebody else is going to die, I'm going to be fine. Mm-hmm. I think that's an extraordinarily important conversation to keep people's attention focused on. That's a challenge. I think the question of focus is one of the challenges. I know that there are artist projects of different lengths and they're all important, but for long-running projects like the ones the Institute has done and the AIDS Quilt too, you get a kind of activism or artist fatigue after a few years. Like, what is the impulse to keep it going? It's a labor of love. The AIDS Chronicles in particular, an enormous amount of physical labor to do because each page has to be painted 6 times. What's the impulse that keeps you going? And also in the sense of focus, with a long-running project, how do you adapt it as the conditions change? The conditions of AIDS changed in the world during those 15 years, and one of the ways we adapted the AIDS project at a certain point was with the first Ebola outbreaks. We started incorporating Ebola into the project because, again, there was a similar set of issues about whether it was being adequately talked about and dealt with in this country and in our newspapers of record in this very, somewhat xenophobic country that we've turned into.
Mm-hmm.
So focus, yeah, it's a tough one. This is going to clearly adapt and be with us for years now. And so if you launch a project now, none of us know what it's going to look like in 3 years.
Right. We don't even know what the art world is going to look like. I mean, are we even going
Yep.
to have galleries, you know?
Yep.
Is everything going to be online?
That's one of the reasons I'm interested in projects that don't take place in galleries, that there's so many other ways to reach people and have these conversations that artists and activists and writers can have with people, the many, many different channels. I know that one of the things I'm seeing talking about artist responses to pandemic is performance artists and artists who have a performative side, like people who do podcasts, are beginning to use Zoom as a medium, because it is a way we reach people right now, just like we're doing at this very minute. And so we're getting a lot of kind of experimental creativity around Zoom that actually reminds me of a lot of the experimental creativity of the early 90s when we all first had video streaming. But the context, of course, is entirely different. And so we will be surfacing a new set of practices and methods.
Well, I think we're nearing our end. This was our first of a series, but I also wanted to find out your thoughts on. I know you did touch upon what you see in the current pandemic informing your work as an artist or citizen in terms of that remains to be seen, and also the beginnings of collecting language or beginning drawings that you would not normally otherwise draw. I think the gravity is too enormous right now for us to be able to begin to see further on down, at least here. But I wanted to ask in conclusion, what are your overriding thoughts and concerns as we face this next pandemic, and where do we go from here?
I'll tell you right out, I'm not actually as interested in art right now as I am in the fact that we're facing a once in a lifetime moment when our culture and society and governmental structure and our ethos could change dramatically. There's an enormous number of ways things could change, or things that have changed already could not go back to normal in ways. If we're lucky, they'll be beneficial to the world. If we're unlucky, they won't be, and probably we'll end up with a mixed bag as always. But so I'm extremely interested in the potential for large-scale social change that is being forced on us.
I feel the same way, and I'm, you know, I like you said, I'm interested in what's going to happen and how I am going to fit into it, and how the art world is going to fit into it. And the ideas that come forth, I think we're all going to be pushed to think about things in different ways, and hopefully, like you said, more good than not will come out of it.
To be continued.
Yeah.
To be continued.
Yeah, it's a good motto.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
Day to day.
Yeah, from day to day. Glad to be here. Anyhow, I sincerely thank you for joining us today on the panel, both of you, and also for everyone joining the conversation. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat room now. We'll be happy to touch on those questions or topics introduced if you want to put anything in there, and if not, that's fine. I will also put in the chat room information on the links that were discussed today, references, and also links to the artists' websites, and I will put them up on the screen. But in the moment, in a moment, actually, let's take just a second.
there's a question about whether a recording will be available. I think we're trying
yes,
to record this, and we're
we are
hoping
recording, and it will be available. And we're going to be putting it on, I believe, Facebook or the Kingston website. Ing will let us know, but we'll get that message out. Any other questions coming in? Okay, one artist recently mentioned that this time for him was a conceptual abyss. How are you feeling about it now?
I think that might have been me, because I said that the first few months, and that this happened also during AIDS.
Okay. Okay.
I think it's like the process of grief. You go through a time when it's all you can think about, and I find that always dampens my creative spirit. It hasn't helped. The fact that I lost a close friend in November means that I've had an almost uninterrupted 6 months of feeling that things are terrible in the world, personally and generally. But then other things start to displace those feelings. I don't think for me, it's not accidental that it's now spring, and it's not accidental that I'm now getting very angry. Rage is always a good place to end up when you want to start either being creative or being active in the world.
Yeah, I know how difficult it is right after the loss of someone you love, and your creativity is just destroyed. And it takes a while to bounce back from that. But I've been inspired to go to my studio and just try some things. It's like I've had a couple of shows cancel and move, and so I've got all this time, and I just want to try, see if I can make something that, you know, looks like fear, looks like grief. I'm experimenting, and it'll probably end up being nothing, but it makes me feel better.
Yeah. This is the kind of thing where I think artists can be so inventive. I could imagine just taking a pencil and stabbing it at a piece of paper because you're so disturbed by the situation. And like I said, I didn't start out to do silly drawings. I was sitting on a couch needing to move my hands, and so I just started moving my hands without any intention, and that's what came out. So a lot of trust in the process to get you out of paralysis, even if the first thing you get isn't the best thing in the world.
Yeah. Yes.
We have another question. How does spiritualism play into artistic practice at times of pandemics? Thoughts on that?
That's a very individual thing.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. As a doctor, I have always seen the human body and just the way biology works as a spiritual experience. And I can't define it any better than that. I'm not part of any religious group or anything. I just feel that a lot of even something horrible like a pandemic, there is a spiritual side to that, because there is a power and something that we are in awe of behind that. And anyway, but that's my take on the spiritual side of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think one has to be careful about applying war metaphors to a pandemic, but I do think about war memoirs as a form, and how you get a complete range from renewal of faith under these kinds of conditions to complete loss of faith. Highly individual, and both of those seem like completely plausible responses to me. I know that my primary feeling, I'm not a person who belongs to a religion either, has been one of gratitude for being alive, a feeling that you get from time to time in the world, but right now I'm feeling it literally every day, which is the last time I felt that prolonged sense of gratitude was back in my 20s when I was in an accident I thought was going to kill me. And so I felt like I'd been given a second life, and that was a matter of enormous gratitude to me for some months after that.
Yes.
And that maybe the ability to feel profound, uncontained gratitude is a spiritual response.
Yeah. I feel that every time I read about a doctor younger than me who's died, you know, it's like, I don't know, just hits close to home.
Thank you. Don't know if we have any more questions, but I think ending on a note of gratitude is quite good for all. It's everyday occurrence in my household. It is. And going simple sometimes is working for me as well. So I thank everyone, and I thank people for joining, and it looks like most people stuck with us throughout. So thank you for helping us fumble through this first time, and we look forward to expanding on this. And again, this is recorded, and it will be up on either the Facebook or website. If you're still out there, if you could type that into the chat channel, that would be wonderful. And I will say goodbye. Thank you. And wish everyone well.
Amy.
Thank you for joining.
Yes. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.